Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second winter term lecture in the lecture series Climate Strike. We've had some weather issues with Gediminas and Nomida Urbonis's lecture, and Emmanuel Pratt, who's speaking tonight, was rescheduled and was unfortunately unable to make the trip today because of the emerging coronavirus issues and just trying to play it safe with international travel at this time. But we're very fortunate to have Emmanuel here by web link to talk to us. So before we begin, my name is Adrian Blackwell. I'm an associate professor here in the architecture school, and I'd like to welcome you all to the school, and I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Waterloo School of Architecture sits on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Neutral, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and we sit within the Haldimand Tract, which was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River, and which over the 2 centuries since it was promised to them was taken from them and sold in different or mortgaged in different ways, and the payments for those mortgages were not paid after some time, and many of the funds that were raised through those mortgages were misappropriated by Canadian governments. So we live in a kind of contested site, and we live in an area where the land is under question, and I think tonight's lecture by Emmanuel Pratt is going to also be thinking hard about land and its uses. So Emmanuel Pratt is one of the founders of Sweetwater Foundation, which is a foundation which works in urban agriculture, produces housing and training for youth on the south side of Chicago. And Emmanuel is a graduate of Cornell University and Columbia University. He's taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Michigan. He's a recipient of the 2019 MacArthur Fellowship, and he was a participant in the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. Emmanuel is, I think, a philosopher of architecture and somebody who really knows how to get things done. He's a community organizer, and we're extremely lucky to have him here to speak and to talk with us about his work. So please welcome Emmanuel Pratt.
Thank you for having me. This is very Black Mirror-ish. It's fascinating. I'm wondering who's going to control my neck and my head as I spin it. But, you know, given the state of affairs of current chaos of our administration here, this is where we landed at. So I apologize for not being there in person. They have had an uptick of presumptive cases within the 2-mile radius where we're at. So, hey, here we are. I am here. So first things first, can you hear me? Yes. You all are now my ears. So I'm gonna jump right to it. I'm gonna close this little box, if you don't mind, right? So I'm here to jump into this conversation about real estate. Great, wonderful. See, eyes and ears, we are a collective brain. So I'm here to discuss this conversation of real estate. What is it? And I think the land acknowledgement is extremely appropriate because I'm not sure how many people understand that we don't acknowledge the land that we're on here in the States. We have the founder of Chicago is actually Jean-Baptiste Dusable, who is a Haitian Black Indian that was married into one of the tribes. And was later moved away from the land in the same way. And there's this lingering question of what is real estate? In the architecture world and real estate development world, in the planning world, we tend to think of a traditional means of development that looks at property and buildings and land. But it's the ownership of the buildings and land that it comes into question. Increasingly in this weird digital world that we live in, there's also the digital space of real estate, like on a desktop, on a hard drive space. So we have to question, what are we talking about in real estate? Because it does affect us across the board. Here we go. So if I show you this, what do you see? An empty lot, correct? There's a question of how big is that empty lot. But so you see my cursor? Are you able to see the cursor? Can you see on the top left-hand side, it says currently showing June of 2019? Correct? That's recent. So typically we think of like, all right, here's some empty land. We should do some initiative with it. If it's an architecture studio, we jump into thinking green buildings or something along the lines of that. But it's really hard without context. So initially, our brains kind of wander to the debate of green versus sustainable, especially given the climate discussions and debates. So the question really is, what is green? What does that mean? Because in reality, green just means green. It means dollars. It's another way of, there's an active process of greenwashing. You say you're going to do something that's a little bit more, it's more environmentally friendly, but it's actually not sustainable. So there's a debate between how do you transition to green versus sustainable? So question, what is that? I hear the laughter. So initially, if in the development world you think of, oh, we'll just go do a green building. What does that mean? You have this vertical green building that has trees all throughout it. It's probably rendered in Revit, X, or something, but zero context. You notice on the left-hand side? On the other side, you have this kind of utopia land that offers an enticing vision of a potential future, but what's the cost? How is it green? Is it like that year-round? And then the other image below here, we have a pretty increased obsession with green walls in the industry. But then this question of like, how does that work? How much does water weigh in our world of 8.34 pounds per gallon? How does water work in that space? How does it flow through the space? Is there soil? Is there not soil? Then the other option of green is this conversation of food, right? Growing food can be much more green and sustainable, but the question is, if you're doing it without light, you're doing it indoors year-round, what's your electricity bill? If you're only growing lettuce, because this is one example. A lot of times people grow indoors, like lettuce, basil, maybe arugula, maybe some greens. Is that technically food? I mean, it's a valid question, right? And what then is the economic value if you're doing something that is devoid of sunlight, not maximizing natural capital? It does a better job of recirculating water, but your electrical bill makes this a price point of a $15 salad. Then you have typically a green building, or somehow it's a elite sustainable building. Not to call this out per se, but it's just an image. You do have your solar panels, you have some sustainable development process, but it's almost $30 million. Then you have an isolated object that usually falls on a campus, not general public, becomes a sculptural object of beauty, but then what is its use and the durational use? Then you have the good old garden that gets oftentimes gets devalued because people can't figure out how to economically make money off at scale. Ironically, I don't know how much you all deal with big data conversations, but people want to know the numbers to do things around impact investment and how do you reframe for real estate that's an empty, or even if you do the land acknowledgement, how much money was actually owed and is it appropriate? Is it even do justice to the injustices that traumas experienced over generations? It's skewed. So when you have a conversation of SRI and ESGs, it's fancy language for sustainable, sustainable, some kind of investment in environmental sustainable governance. But there's a question of what does that mean? What does impact actually mean? So, but at the end of the day, we're still left with a vacant lot, right? And again, so using our tools a lot of times, unfortunately, in this very digital age, we will look at Google Maps, Google Street View, and look at watch the left-hand corner, June of 2019. It's the subliminal game. Next slide. I don't know how much you do this, but in our world, we look how long at Street View, how long has it been empty? So I can go back to May of 2011 and realize that, whoa, this thing's empty. So what's the actual real estate value on your market? Is it high or low? And then what's missing from the scene? In one picture, I don't see a fire hydrant. I don't see stop signs. I see at least a fire hydrant 7 years ago. But then to go back even further and we look from a different angle, this is the earliest Street View. Google would not even go to that corner in 2007, which means that this area is a challenged area. And what you see in this area is to show vacant buildings, empty lots. It's been empty for a while. So if you think about this from the subliminal and subliminal framework, subliminal messaging is that it's probably not a good area. The superliminal is like, wait a second, it's been empty for how long? 20 years? That's called benign neglect or municipal disinvestment, where you just let the market ride and you let it just crumble. That's a conscious decision. When we pan around the area, again, looking at Google Street View, you see that there's various levels of stability, instability in that same neighborhood. This does not paint a pretty picture. Especially when you are now looking and identifying you're on the south side of Chicago, which is portrayed as being rid of gun violence, gang issues, vacancy, fires, abandonment. Doesn't paint a good picture, does it? What it does paint a picture of is blight. This term blight, I don't know how much the audience there knows with this term, but when they say it's death and decay of a building, an urban blight, it's interesting because it's actually lifted from paleontology in the study of plants and the death and decay of a crop so that it no longer sustains life. So it's actually a term from biology that got used in the built environment world to say that there's not a value there. So when we return back to this blighted property, there's a question. What is the value? So the only way to think about it, we start to delink and break down variables and understand. You see all the empty parcels? So let's just focus. Draw a boundary. Now, what's this? See the city-owned parcels? It's a major percentage of the area, right? Absentee owned. That means people that own the land that are not contributing anything to the land. They don't live in the area. They just purchased it, hopefully, probably to try and buy and flip. What we've understood is there's an ecology of absence. Of the 174 parcels, 79% are vacant, 58% are owned by the city, 24% are owned by absentee, and only 9% owned by homeowners that live in the neighborhood. So there is a constructed ecology of absence in that context. When we look at the zoning, it becomes even weirder. So in this empty parcel, see how it's empty here up top? In the zoning map, you see a mysterious building that doesn't exist. We see a number of other buildings that don't exist, but it is zoned for commercial. We have manufacturing. We have two different types of commercial and residential. But it wasn't always this way. What a lot of times people miss when they don't do due diligence and historical sociotemporal analysis, they don't understand context. In 1895, if you look at the image on the left, you can see the density that used to be there. So in the States, we have the historical Sanborn maps that tell us, a lot of times they go all the way back to, I think, until in Chicago to the fire, 1870. We have records of the density of how the land was used, how much housing was there, and you'll also notice that the street names change. On the left-hand side, it's Armour Avenue. On the right-hand side, it's Grove Avenue. But watch the density. In 1926, it's still dense, but we had the Great Depression here, 1930s, and then if you look at this, April 1st, 1936, there was an underwriting manual that explicitly said that a change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction of values. So with our history of racism, in the 1940s, a colored housing project was introduced to the same area here. And by 1949, when there was urban renewal that started to transform the neighborhoods, introducing roads and highways in particularly challenged neighborhoods, there became a redlining process that says these are the hazardous areas and these are the areas to be saved. If you look very closely, you notice that this is the University of Chicago on one side, and the other side has been deemed hazardous because of its virtually 100% Negro occupancy. So it's pretty explicit, and it's pretty conscious to the decision to carve up the areas and shift the perceptions of good versus bad based off of race and class. Fast forward to 2012, the same area is hollowed out. So from a short-term lens, you would never understand how it happened. And a developer's approach would be, let's just develop the whole area. But the reality of race and class and fear is such that no one wants to touch it. So it doesn't paint a pretty picture. It gets even more complicated when people say, oh, well, I can sell it for $5,000, $25,000. You see on the bottom right hand, you can get empty lots up to $250,000, $250,000 for an empty lot in Inglewood, the south side of Chicago. So it really does highlight the question of value. In the planning, in urban planning, internationally, there is a understanding of useful, fruitful production of land. It's a creation of usufructuaries. It's not really honored because people are so skewed in terms of how much money they can make off of everything. So there's a question of what is value? Is it about the money, or is it about principle? Is it about something higher than just money? So in the States, again, we have this history of segregation and redlining, particularly in Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, cities in the Rust Belt. And if you want to do a reductive look, in the same city that I'm sitting in right now, in Chicago, $3.2 billion was lost between 1950 and 1970 because people played on fear from black neighborhoods. 20 years, $3.2 billion. But does that paint an appropriate picture? One would argue that the active process of displacement, much like a plant that you uproot and transplant, experiences root shock. So people are constantly trying to figure out, where's my home? Where's my school? How does my family exist? Where do you have a job? So we go back to that vacant lot. It's still vacant. Enter Sweetwater Foundation. We're a 501c3. It's an NGO. Our tagline, very appropriately, is there grows the neighborhood. We focus on a mixed methods approach of regenerative neighborhood development. It has all the rhetoric, creating safe and healthy, inspiring, curating healthy intergenerational communities. It's not just rhetoric, it's actually what we do. But a lot of people say these things. But our practice, it's not a mission. That's colonial. Our practice, we're trying to do that, get better at it, is to shift from a degenerative process to a much more regenerative living system design process, which is qualitative and quantitative. It's ecological, it's a living conscious system. Requires less and less energy. It's much more restorative. So we operate in what we call the third sector. So in between the public and private sector, you have a third sector, which is the social economy, where the work gets done. While people are trying to decide where the money is and who can do what, we still live in the world, have to get it done. So we do practice a mixed bag of art, architecture, agriculture, aquaponics, carpentry, planning, education. So an example is a foreclosed house. The house put on the market with a real estate value of $460,000, $500,000 in 2007. It foreclosed several times to the tune of $31,000. It's a crazy market depreciation. Do you see how empty the area is around it? Right? This is actually right around the corner from that empty lot that we've been looking at the whole time. Within 3 years, with a collective process of engaging the neighborhood, engaging our team, intergenerational workers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, gardeners, just global citizens, we turned it around into a place. I'm actually calling you from the window right where that head is. Right up. That's where I'm at right now. So it's a pretty drastic change. We call this the think, do house. Think it, do it, share it, mix it with somebody else. So we have a garden bed open to the public. We have a house that is functionally a community school, like literally a community school, where we have field trips from youth of all ages. We have gardens that are open to the public. A lot of the school projects go straight out into the garden. Obviously, this is more of a warm period of time, but we also do stuff year round. We have a lot of elders in the area that are first generation from the Great Migration. Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama know exactly what to do with all that good food because they're preparing meals for the families. So again, it's open to the public with no fences. The mural is just a backdrop that just causes people to daydream and imagine. This is Coco and her family. So she makes a point to bring her kids to come through, and the grandbabies and anybody in her family just come through. She's been in the neighborhood for 50 years. Anybody experience a living cucumber? That's what it is. So it's a great place to grow food, experience fresh, healthy produce, which is not what you would get in your perception of this neighborhood otherwise. It's completely misaligned with what the media portrays our neighborhood. We have farmers markets on site. It's a great place for youth and elders to intermix. We have tons of produce. Obviously, again, in Chicago, it's cold, but we're currently indoors growing seedlings to prepare for the spring. What's nice is that we're technically, quote unquote, a food desert. And I say quote unquote because, I mean, that's an unnatural phenomenon. I don't know where that term really became such a hot topic, but that's a conscious decision to not invest in certain neighborhoods to offer food. It also creates a mindset that overly reliant doesn't really embrace the realities of the regenerative principles of food, how it grows. Every one of these plants has seeds. So the beauty of it is our ecology of our place has transformed so drastically in 5 years that it competes with some natural prairies. So we have all types of native and honeybees. Most people don't even know what a native or solitary bee is. They're bees that are actually in the area that have, unfortunately, are erased how we approach and development. We have monarch butterflies, we have all types of moths, we have pest hoppers, praying mantis. So there's a 2-acre farm that is a space of education, of feeding, of nurturing, of employment. And then across the street, we activate the house. It is a house for, I mean, it's not really a house for all, but it kind of feels like a house for all. We've opened the house up to be a space for commenting, where we can actively negotiate our differences, but also build stuff together, grow stuff and cook stuff together. The kitchen is a classroom where you might have a social entrepreneur that's a chef that has, like Chef Cordell, who's in a book about his experiences, but then you have youth that come in that want to learn from the same mentors, and they cook together. And you have Mama Betty. Mama Betty embodies culture. Mama Betty is from Alabama and has all types of knowledge and wisdom and history. She's also eyes and ears for the site. She knows the neighborhood. She knows the people. She knows everybody. So the kitchen is much more than just a simple kitchen. It is a space of commenting and communal sharing. Our living room becomes an active space of living room. Our basement becomes a tinkering and a share space. Everything we do becomes art inspired, ecologically inspired by what's growing. So we do printmaking. We make our own shirts, make our own bags. The spaces have kind of aesthetically transformed by us claiming wood that has been discarded from waste stream of the city. We allow for spaces for musicians to play and gather. We have fresh produce, farm to table experiences that are super sexy, right? But this is interesting. We created a public shop as a space for carpentry for the neighborhood. So when you have wasted wood and you reclaim that wasted wood, instead of it going to the waste stream and waste management, you actually have basic tools for, table saw, sanders, miter saws. We start designed objects. So what happens when you get a crate and construct the crate to design a crate that becomes a modular stackable system that creates a market? And then we host public workshops. How to make that crate. You'll see, pay attention to this thing because this shows up a lot, the rest of the lot. It's interesting when you're in a public alleyway creating public furniture as a lesson plan in 2D and 3D and learning how to build to reclaim empty space that was formerly vacant, to reclaim it into a public space for the neighborhood. And then we started to design other products. Each one teach 5, and then also we have a market for reclaimed wood that becomes another source of an inspiration for education and lesson plans. We flipped a lot of different rooftops, same material. But the spaces read differently now. It becomes a space that's welcoming and inviting. And then we got to a point where we decided to design a pavilion So we raised the first timber frame barn in the history of Chicago since the fire. Partnered with International Woodworking Guild. We did a block party to raise a structure. It's an open air structure for people to gather and eat, and mingle, and share stories and performances, reclaim the streets through basketball, play, work. But now we've become a tourist destination. And when we have a block party, thousands will show up. Where we get to celebrate culture. And you see how diverse the audience is. And it's actually really amazing. We have sound system live performances, and you can hear from blocks away. It draws people to come and share and perform and play and dine. So it's much more of a dream space. And especially when the sunflowers hit, you make all these nice, neat, organized rows, and the squirrels and the rabbits and everything else disperse all the seeds, and then you have sunflower rows. So we've enclosed the space to become, again, an indoor-outdoor space, a liminal space of dreaming. We added a fifth star to the Chicago flag to do celebrations of freedom, celebrating Juneteenth. Juneteenth was the day that African Americans were actually informed they were free years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So we have this designed object that sits in the landscape. It's just a gathering space in the farm, the south side of Chicago, where people can sing, do yoga, reflect, eat, share, farm to tables for all walks and all ages. Doesn't have to be over expensive. That's wood. That's reclaimed wood. That's one of the performers from the International Puppet Show. You see those kids' reactions. Can't make that up. So we do have a wide array of usages and public meetings to talk about politics or design or life. And at nighttime, the place glows. So much like the seeds of sunflower, we focus on the regenerative principles of humanity. What are these spaces of humanity that we can design, that we can kind of experiment with and just reclaim, because we have to renegotiate our understanding and value of land, of humans, humanity, and how we can all coexist. So we go back to that vacant lot. And what the maps don't typically show you is that in that same area, we pretty much program 90% of the area. So Sweetwater Foundation has a farm, garden, housing, and a communal footprint. So instead of just mowing the lawn to be empty, we decided to design another designed object, which is much more in line with housing. So worker cottages in the area from the 1900s. So you can see the barn in the backdrop. So we created first the platform, aka the stage. We started to partner with Trillium Dell to work with the woodworking guild. We hand raised the structure in 5 hours. And then it became a space of exploration because it also caught people's attention because it's on tracks and it would move. So one person can move this thing back and forth. Because we wanted to talk about a modular housing, not tiny housing. So language of material speaks across the street. It gets reframed by the ecology of the place. And then we participated in the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which was great. Moved the structure, we deconstructed it, reconstructed it, cultural center, 7.5 miles away, and the neighborhood got pissed. Where's our structure? So we had to design another one. So in the process of redesigning it, sketching, ideations, math, figuring out what materials we have, reclaimed materials, polycarbonate. Started designing a modular structure that we played with fire started, like literally playing with fire. In the alleyways, we came up with a modular design that we then started to hand raise on the same plot. What was nice about it is, again, it still has that language and continuity. We had a loss of the team. We lost one of the team members, and we had a memorial in the process of building the structure, but we wanted to meet at the meeting house, and it gained a new name as the meeting house, even though it was, unfinished. But as we began to transform the space, neighbors began to engage, people started to activate the space. We hand raised the site. And it became a pavilion again, another structural project for education, for meetings. And then as we started to think about it as a marketplace, we started to dare to dream about what else it could be. So we started thinking about kinetic sculptures and new programming. And as it got colder, we enclosed it with the polycarbonate. So it kind of glows. But the bottom line is introduced a conversation of rethinking the worker cottage in a 21st century context. So we're designing housing now on the same empty parcels. That's our footprint. It's the commons, the footprint today. That we've programmed farm, barn. We've renovated a house from 1891, and that's a live, work, and gallery space. We have a park. But what we're doing is introducing it as the Commonwealth. We're rebranding this area as the Commonwealth, where we start to think about what is the appropriate structure, space, and design of housing. Instead of just designing it house by house, directly next to each other, empty parcels, we want to space them out and start to activate the space and at the same time renovate other neighbors' houses. So if it's a porch, if the windows, furniture inside, we're activating neighbors. And then now we have this vision of how that approach from move towards 100 houses in a 10, 15 block radius. So we have another way of thinking about see, touch, taste, hear, smell that does challenge how we think about our structures of consciousness in the area. It's not just about a building. It's not just about a single object. It's about an integrated approach that does appreciate and value like people, planet, and profit. So, but it's interesting because a lot of times we have a reductive approach that says, there's a vision of what it can happen, and then if it doesn't happen a certain way, you penalize for it. So we'd like to think about, like Frederick Douglass says, it's the picture of life contrasted with the fact of life, the ideal contrasted with the real, which makes criticism possible. Where there is no criticism, there is no progress. And I use this slide because most people don't know who Frederick Douglass really was, but he's one of the most photographed African Americans in, I think, to date. He commissioned a lot of self-portraits. He wanted to annihilate the stigmatism and the negative stereotypes of African Americans. So he photographed himself all the time. But the last 30 years of his life he dedicated to his housing. So now, to conclude, this is how we dream about what the possibility of the future is. And it's not just about simply the land or an object. It's a much different philosophical approach towards a triple bottom line, how we design our community that grows a neighborhood. That's it. Wow, it's dark there. Okay. Definitely. I mean, I kept it a little bit brief because, again, I don't know how this whole Black Mirror thing works.
We do have a mic, yes. So are there any questions for Emmanuel?
Also, is this fine? Because I closed out that one screen, and I don't want to have a really big head.
You're actually on the small screen right now, so why don't you make your head really big? It'll still be life size. It'll be perfect.
Okay.
It'll be perfect.
Good.
Yeah, go. Can you make it big? Make your head big.
I don't think so.
No. You're on a little screen, so you're only like an inch, a half an inch big right now. That's
Stop
better.
sharing.
That's better. Now that's good. That's good.
All right.
Are there any questions? Yes, good.
I'm just curious about how you got all this started. Like, typically the beginning is the hardest part, trying to get people to mobilize. So could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. A little back in my past, I started off as that kind of wayward artist, architect. Actually, to be honest, I was doing more art and music. And then I found my way into architecture school because people said you can't be an artist or musician, you got to get a real job. So I drifted into architecture school at Cornell. And one of my biggest discontents with the school and eventually the profession was that it operated in its own world. It didn't really care about context. It's like design objects, and it just wasn't really for the people of community that I could afford. So I wanted to do more. Wow, hi SketchUp. So when I started, I went into grad school to learn more think about not just architecture, but context and neighborhood design. And I got continually frustrated because it was like a lack of context of the neighborhoods that I either grew up in or lived in or what have you. So I started with, am I frozen? Okay, cool. So there was a big challenge between dealing with stuff academically and then moving into the profession. And there was a huge disconnect between you can do anything in any kind of way with any kind of design, and you get to the real world, and then they say you can't do anything. You're dealing with who's the client, where's the money, what's the timeline, cheapest possible way to do everything. But I was constantly working in areas. I was living in areas that were never offered good design, or it was like completely afterthought or mistake. Something like that happened in the neighborhood, and so when we started an outreach in schools, we actually were taking some of the schools that they were closing. I don't know how much you know about Chicago's history, but they closed like 60 schools at the same time. Literally just one. Predominantly in the south and west sides of Chicago, predominantly in areas of poverty, color, communities of color. So we started these little experiments of just building out classroom spaces off radar through hydroponics and aquaponics. And in the process of meeting people and meeting families, it kind of branched out of the classroom into the outdoor spaces of the schools. And by the time I found myself at this neighborhood that we're in right now, at between Washington Park and Inglewood, they had closed a lot of the schools in a 5-mile radius, and we couldn't continue to sustain our relationships with the same schools in the same way. So when our local government asked, "Hey, can you do something in this area?" we're like, "Yeah, we can." And the beauty of it is they just let us get going. There was a lot of empty land, And what we had to do was start by meeting people. Ironically, a lot of people that we already knew through the schools were from the same neighborhood. So it made the entry point kind of easy. What's not easy is that people will suffer from various forms of mental health disparities, or there is a level of crime and violence you have to navigate accordingly. And when you start telling people you're farming in the neighborhood, look sideways, like, what? But the second you actually employ people and you start to develop more of a relationship and people benefit from the food, the trust is formed. So we started as one big old experiment. And it's just been cultivated ever since. The reason I liken the term of urban acupuncture is we would identify a stress point that everybody in the neighborhood knew. If it was a house and it was like something negative, extremely negative happened historically in one of the houses, or the empty school, or you would do an installation that was a collective and participatory installation that would just start a conversation of something different. Because honestly, like the house we're in, the new house, was a lot of negative traffic that would happen in the house prior to our arrival. So one reason we put the mural up is we wanted people to think about something different. And they say, what is that? What's the mural mean? It's people reflecting. It's people being hopeful. And what's in it? What's the thing? Come on in, come inside and see. So point being, we just started just cultivating the human infrastructure and relationships with people on the ground, and just kind of making it up as we went along until we started finding like consistent patterns. You know, that waste stream of wood, I don't know how much you know about, like we get like tons of wood from the Chicago, like the public transit system. Every time there's a bus shelter, or anytime there's a new development that has tons of windows, it's delivered in wood, in crates, which will literally be tossed and go to the landfill. So we started deflecting that, and then started to design and make stuff that was giving back to the community. I mean, it's been a decade.
You've mentioned how people have stayed with you, how this community has grown. I think there's a transition point, though, where you need to continue to be welcoming. So how do you welcome and continue to grow?
How long do we welcome?
How do you welcome people and continue to
No,
grow?
it's actually extremely appropriate and really timely question, because there's a lot of hype around inclusivity. You can become a victim of your own success very quickly. Gentrification. And also, if you just open your doors to be inclusive and people aren't actually participating and being productive, then there's a serious problem. So we've very, very much told people, like, we're about inclusivity but intention. So whenever we have a public event, we make sure we do have food for all. We make sure the price points are appropriate. Whenever we have a farmer's market or sale, if there are people from the neighborhood are unemployed, homeless, caregivers, what have you, we make sure that there's a type of sliding scale of a price point. But if somebody comes in and they have capital that they can afford, they offer what is right. And we make sure that that's the relationship. There's also a challenge of kind of who do you make housing for? Because we have a population that, quite honestly, if you are between the ages of 16 to 26, 28, 30, and you don't have a stable job, you will get slumlorded. You cannot find a safe place to stay. And we have a lot of people that actually get foreclosed while they're renting at a place and are told after the fact and move within 30 days. So we try as best as we can to be inclusive, but again, with intention. We have a priority on local, on the folks that have been experienced the most marginalization in the area. We also have a really interesting relationship with police here. And I mean that like not joking. I mean, we have a population that's typically targeted by police, historically targeted by police. But at the same time now, we're creating a new relationship where the police are saying this is one of the safest areas in a 4-block radius. It's one of the safest areas. They just hang out and talk to folks. And it's a really interesting phenomenon because that doesn't really normally happen. So we curate it. And as we own more property, as we design a community land trust, more residents to keep them to stay in the area. There's a very intentional land trust that we're designing as a community land trust. We then own the land collectively, and then the objects on top, we determine what the market rates are. It's different. It's just very different. If that answers your question.
I was just curious to know a little bit more about what happens in winter.
And in winter, we're indoors. We have 2 houses that we renovated the past 2 years, but it was full gut transformation of one of the houses that took the whole entire team. We have a core team of like 12 to 15 of our staff. It's a great, has anybody ever had to renovate a house? It's probably one of the best educational experiences you'll ever have. I mean, actually tying your joists, hanging your drywall, and going back to a house from 1891. We started to find like the memories of the family's house. So that became one massive project. We have 2 greenhouse. We do programming in the winter in the barn, even though it sounds really crazy. It's essentially a polycarbonate structure that retains heat to a degree, and you can just run space heaters and what have you, and then when it's 0 degrees, it's usually around 40 or 50 degrees inside. When we need more heat, we bring on a sunny day, it can get up to 50 or 60 degrees inside that space. We have a workshop, a greenhouse that is the workshop that we run year round. So also in the winter, we tend to focus on schools and outreach. So we cultivate the relationships indoor. We will do art installations at different galleries that kind of design new relationships with different places. So, like art galleries are year round and they usually have a calendar per quarter. So that's a great to get some commissions that we can then do, different types of designs that pay for the work. So it's interesting. In the fall, we tend to do more art-related external and school projects. In the winter, we tend to go all internal and focus on training the team and outreach to different schools, build relationships. By the time it gets spring, we start to be more outside and identify more outdoor projects in our neighborhood and around the area. By the summer, it's full like outdoor activities all the way until the fall again. Because you need as many hands as possible to deal with like 4 blocks.
Can I ask a question about the land trust? I love the way your talk started with a lot, a single lot, and the way you kind of constantly return to the lot and the land division and the history of land division. as a way of understanding the history of this place. I thought it was an amazing lesson for all of us. And you finished by talking a lot about the land trust. And so the land trust is a way of rethinking those lots, in a sense. I'm wondering, what kind of a land trust you envision, how you might acquire land for the land trust, but also how you're thinking of organizing the housing. Is it primarily a rental land trust, or are people going to own buildings or lease buildings, or how do you organize how are you conceiving of this project, which is very ambitious, to rethink land and its ownership?
Well, what we started doing with the 2 houses that we have already is that we have we have a balance between local apprentices and humans in residence. They are people that are working within the organization that live and work in the community. So in the Think Do House, we have a room that is dedicated for people to come in and stay for however long a duration. We've had, 2 months, 3 months, short stay, a week or two, a week visit. In the Reconstruction House across the street, one from 1891, we have bedrooms that are allocated for, again, residents and humans residents. We have a gallery on the ground floor. But the new house that we're designing is actually we're targeting a group that is it's interesting because if we can do 2 houses, we want to do one for local apprentices, and we also want to do one that has a family, because we have some team members that have kids. So it's a multi-family it's a single family house with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths. That would allow for a family to have a rental framework with us, but an actual affordable housing rental framework. So cost of the construction and fabrication of the house is actually extremely minimal because we're baking in labor through the organization. And so the price of affordability comes in at half of the price per square foot. So then your rental framework is kind of negligible because it's actually truly affordable. And if we were to put it on the market for sale, it would become a pathway for home ownership, for opportunity for families that would never be able to own a house. So the way land trusts work is we actually do own multiple parcels in the land, in the surrounding area, and we're able to take that out of a private market because we own it. We have partnerships with other homeowners in the area, and we're discussing possible life needs. We have an agreement that they can stay in their house for the duration of however long they choose, because they're actively part of our collective network. So they might be getting market baskets. It might be acting as quote-unquote clients to the apprentices. So if somebody says they need some furniture done, it's baked into the programming. It's baked into our everyday activities. But if they so choose to move, then the ownership transitions over to the organization, and then it stays within the neighborhood, within the network, and we get to reprogram the house to become either rental or home ownership for somebody in the network. So it actually is like looking at realistic, affordable housing, both in rental and in ownership.
So I don't think that there are at the moment. Emmanuel, thank you so much for such a generous presentation about such an incredible project. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate your time. I have a question. So is this like totally crazy? Because I mean, a lot of times people think I'm absolutely apeshit crazy, right? And to us, it's like this is maybe it is crazy, but maybe this is what we need to do. So what? Because otherwise, so yeah, in terms of a studio, like how much does this resonate with your studios? No one wants to be the bad person, right?
Oh, okay, here we've got someone.
I'm probably off camera, but we're doing like slightly larger scale work right now in our studio for sort of, I guess, lower income peoples in East Toronto. And it's,
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's like super similar to the Chicago situation, but it's mainly like this sort of single family scape with a few vacant lots that we're trying to sort of reappropriate and add like a certain amount of density to.
Yeah.
Which I found that this resonated with me insofar as like community outreach and like community participation in building and in like building this community is really possible.
Yeah.
As long as you're sort of like on the ground, boots on the ground with the right kind of like types of programming, I think.
Yeah.
I guess I even wanted to ask this, but I didn't know how to really phrase it. But like at the scale that we're doing, which is like about 250 units per like 300 meter square site, so like pretty decent density, like that feels like more of like a patriarchal, like just kind of drop a
Top down.
building down and then like hope that the community comes and like fills it in and like fixes it so that it actually fits, when like there's only a certain amount of a design that can actually do that, or like as a designer there's only so much that you can do to foster that.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you've highlighted is the whole pedagogical kind of crisis, because you can design a studio as best you want to be kind of like, hey, we want to be well intended, but if you don't have a relationship with the neighborhood, if you don't understand the context, like there's a limit to what you can actually achieve, especially within a 3 to 6 month window, right? So you do the best you can, right? So, and this kind of goes back to the question that was asked earlier, like how did I get my start? I started in the space that you're in now, you know, exploring the ideas, reading as much as possible. Unfortunately, architecture world, you don't sleep ever, right? Which is not healthy. I don't recommend it, but I'm very much conditioned to that. 42 years of age, my body will no longer let me do all-nighters back to back. My daughter also will make sure that that does not happen, right? But I used my space in the academic world to think and criticize as much as possible, and to put really crazy ideas out there. But then once I graduated and got into a real world context, I personally challenged myself to try and make it as real as possible, to the limits of whatever I can do. I'm actually very much known as an agitator and a disruptor. I think, Adrian, you experienced some of that firsthand. But it is a positive disruption to the system, because we know what does not. And I think you all have a great opportunity to raise your voices and share different ideas and alternatives. You have to critically engage on what can possibly work, but highlight why it does not work. Because there's only so much you can do. Like you said it, you can design these mega programs, but unless you have a chance to test that theory, you kind of run into like utopia land.
I think one of the reasons you're speaking to us tonight, Emmanuel, is to inspire us to think more radically about what housing, urban design, architecture can do. So I think you're an important contribution to this term's pedagogical process, and hopefully people will feel inspired and free to think a lot more radically than they often do in school.
Well, I think this is a really fun space to be in, even though it's virtual. But if you think about labor, or if you think about like materials and materiality, it's how often is it actually appreciated by the system? You usually want to build something as cheap and as fast as possible, and it's kind of cookie cutter, falls within the standards. But how sustainable is that? And part of our challenge is where we're at right now. It actually makes zero economic sense in a traditional framework to do any work that we do. And yet we exist for 10 years and growing. It makes zero economic sense to train, to actually think about like some of the design objects we make. I mean, you can machine make them, or you can export them somewhere overseas, and you completely strip out any of the humanity or the human interactions, and you have a product, but there's no relations. No relationship to materials, no relationships to the neighbors, and no relationships to humans. And what we've found, and what everyone in the area appreciates, and why it's getting more attraction and more attention, is because the work is not just about dollars at all. I mean, we have a neighborhood where we render as much as possible, render the invisible visible. So like the waste stream, or the amount of food and production, the waste of we compost everything. We have wood chippers when the trees fall down, or if it's, residential chippers, residential tree companies. They usually get fined and penalized for dropping off when they chip wood. Usually would otherwise send them to a landfill. We then receive the wood chips. It accelerates our soil. We hire more people, generate more soil, we generate more partners and neighbors. We have more requests in for garden beds. We have more partnerships with the school. It's totally regenerative. And it's for a fraction of the cost of the waste stream. So I guess that's what I'm challenged. Like, it's funny because the definition of radical actually means of or restoring to the root. You should look that up.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite. It's a little
definition. The definition of radical, the actual definition of the term radical, means of or restoring to the root. And it's like one of those things that we've kind of skewed totally out of perspective, where we think of extremism and terror and either or radical, like I got to burn the whole system down. It's like, actually, no. We can reroot the system and hold people accountable.
So what do you think about the Democratic primary?
Oh God. I think it is insanity playing out real time, and people are preparing themselves for the worst right now.
A lot of what you do is super human-based and community-centric, and the foundation kind of becomes this nucleus within a 4-block range, sort of. I think a big issue when we're designing new buildings and architectures is the whole gentrification around it
Yep.
and displacement of people. Have you found that through this project and the foundation that there's any kind of the inverse of that? Are people wanting to move towards this community more or this spot in
Yep.
a more permanent way?
Yep. So we let's talk very honestly about it. There are properties 1 block away that we have housing from 1890 to 1910. Housing stock, the age of the housing, it's like from 1890 to 1910. You have houses going for $12,000. You can get a 2,500 square foot house a block away for $12,000. We ended up picking up a church. We own now a church. Yes, it's crazy. That was a house that got converted to a church, and we ended up picking up 5 contiguous parcels on either side because we had to. Because when it hit on the market, somebody else would have picked it up. There is market speculation happening now. So the same foreclosed house that we got for $30,000 is now valued at $250,000. It's happening, and this kind of goes back to the inclusive conversation. Who do you invite and how do you invite them? In the States, we have this thing what they call them land aggregators. They just go around and buy up land that they can get for, if it's going from $100 a square foot to 10 to 15 a square foot, they just pick it up like the stock market and they hold it. And that's one of the absentee owners. There are more and more people coming around that come around saying, wait, price per square foot on the spreadsheet that we looked at. And then we see them. So we stop them and talk to them. And that goes one of 2 ways. It either invites people to have more of a conversation of context and a human relationship, or it scares them off. So either way is our benefit. We have stopped 3 developers to come into the neighborhood because they were looking at us from a spreadsheet from afar, and when they showed up, we engaged them. They said, well, shit, you have a big footprint here, and we can't develop as normal. But it's tricky because if the city partners with certain universities that are in our geographic proximity, and then they start partnering with other people, then we become extremely attractive for people to live here. And then we cannot stay. So one reason why we started looking to land for us is we've already amassed about like 15 to 20 parcels and 3 building structures that we're starting to understand pooling of resources collectively, so we can pick up when another house went on the market it dropped from $150,000 to $50,000 last week. So we have to pick something up just in order to hold it and secure it, in order to make sure that other people won't get it. Because we're becoming extremely attractive. But we're finding the right people to participate and collaborate with. So we'll see what happens. There's no answer.
I think one of the things we talked about today in the studio that Daniel just discussed with you is the idea of thinking architecture in relation to the things around it, in relation to contexts, in relation to non-human forces. So really thinking about an architecture of relations. And I think, the pedagogical limits that you outlined around the studio that we're doing, which doesn't engage a community directly, are very valid. But I think, nonetheless, many of the concepts that you're talking about are things that we can think through with design.
Absolutely.
And so I really appreciate the way this lecture has unlocked these different forms of relation that I think should be at the heart of architectural practice.
Well, also, if you don't frame the bigger picture in order to actually have these type of conversations, then you miss the point. I think, this is the moment in school where you should be like really cracking your brain, saying like, what's a different way of doing this approach? But you have to also understand how things work in the world to unlearn them in order to dream bigger. So it is the moment to say, this is what we understand is happening. You can identify, like, again, frameworks of accountability, but then also, another example, real world. I'm like, wait a second, we work like a park. People understand parks. How much money is put towards the park? Okay, when I look at Chicago Parks District's operational budget, just to frame it into context, half of 1% of their annual operational budget is $2.4 million. So that's a good figure to play with and dream with. Because we can figure out what we can do with $2.4 million friggin' dollars.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel.
Thanks again.